Okay, thank you so much for your patience and understanding. This is a recorded lecture to substitute for Class 5 of PA 511 Public Policy Analysis. Um, in this session, we will be entering into covering what we need to know with respect to cost benefit analysis, as well as some other topics that relate to understanding cost benefit analysis, particularly the issues of opportunity cost, which is an important element to understand in order to be able to do a comprehensive analysis of a given policy recommendation or policy idea. This is going to be a little bit of a challenge because normally when I do these in class, there's a lot of back and forth, a lot of engagement with you, the students, and because this is being pre-recorded and just being made available to you as a lecture, it is there's not as much interaction. So it's important that you read the text that's been assigned. I will also take whatever time is necessary during our class on Thursday, October 6th, to cover anything that needs to be covered again with respect to what we are going to cover in this session. So I realize I'm a little late in getting this lecture out. There were some things that I needed to take care of, and I appreciate your understanding. I would say that this topic is not as mathematically complicated as some people make it out to be. This is more about understanding the general concepts, but it's still very important because it is an expectation that those who make policy decisions, particularly senior staff and elected officials and the public at large, have when it comes to evaluating policy for consideration of implementation. And this is something that we do need to spend some time covering. So I will do my best in the course of this lecture to cover everything, and then we will have plenty of time to discuss it prior to your need to be able to show your proficiency in this area, your understanding of this area later in the semester. So we're going to primarily focus on the reading for this class, which I realize is pretty voluminous. There are the 2 chapters from the Snell text that I assigned. We'll cover the first one, just kind of covering the basic principles of cost benefit analysis. Then we will then go into chapter 1 of the Jiva and Vildovsky text, which focuses on kind of an operational approach to the work in policy analysis in terms of problem definition. As we know that a lot of times Vildovsky described early on in the primary text about how policy analysis is a solution in search of a problem, and problem definition is a critical aspect of being able to conduct effective cost benefit analysis. Then we'll go back to Snell, chapter 2, quantifying and valuing cost and benefits. And that's really important, is, in doing the analysis, is really figuring out what are the costs, what are the benefits, and being able to effectively quantify and value them. Then we'll go back to the main Vildovsky text in chapter 7 and 8, chapter 7 covering opportunity cost and merit wants, and then chapter 8 dealing with the economy, environmental rationale, and ritual. This course, and then we will discuss at the end what the assignment is for next week, which is a follow-up to what you will find in your syllabus for the class that will be held in person and on Zoom on October 6th. So when we're talking about the basic principles of cost benefit analysis, and this is covered in more detail in the Snell text, chapter 1, but the reality is that there is a certain element of it that is a common sense aspect to it. So I want to try to simplify it to the best, because your ability to simplify the practice will be able to enable you to be able to do it more effectively in the field. Cost benefit analysis, a lot of times when it is taught in a very regimented and formulaic process approach, which is good. And at the same time, there are a lot of situations where you find yourself needing to do an analysis fairly quickly, almost a back of the envelope analysis to try to figure out, is something worth pursuing? So there is a need to, of course, approach it from a very formal perspective. There's also a need to kind of have it as a concept that you can easily apply in any given situation, that you can be able to do fairly quickly and efficiently, that can be fairly effective. And this is very important. And really, the question that we are asking ourselves and trying to answer in cost benefit analysis is, simply put, is it worth it? That is something that we really have to take into consideration, and we have to be deliberate about it, because a lot of times when it comes to policy, there is a tendency to want to do something. That is a natural human characteristic, that when we see something, there's a need to do something about it. And that's not necessarily a bad thing. And at the same time, we have to be aware that when we choose to do something, we are exerting the utilization of resources. We are putting resources into play. And when we get to the discussion of opportunity cost, there's the issue when it comes to opportunity cost, that those resources that we are putting into play in a given situation, short term or long term, those resources could potentially be used for something else. And if we're not careful and don't think through whether or not something is truly worth doing and trying to quantify and value it, then we are faced with a circumstance where we could see that we made a mistake. And this happens a lot, and it can happen in your own individual lives. There are probably circumstances and examples you can think of in your own life where you chose to do something, you did it, didn't really generate the worth or value that it thought it was going to, and then you realize, hey, I could have done something else with my time or my money or whatever the case may be, that you missed out on. So these are things that we really have to be aware of and think about in the context of doing cost benefit analysis. And there are several key steps that we need to take, and they go into further detail in chapter 1. Of course, the first thing we have to do is be able to define the decision. Also, when I talk about policy, and I think I mentioned this before, policy is a decision, it's a course of action. And that's really what we have to define. And in order to define it, we not only have to look at what we are recommending, we also have to look at alternatives. Chances are, in any given situation, there is not one singular way of approaching a decision or a course of action. There are alternatives to consider. There are multiple ideas that we need to take into consideration. There are other ways that we can solve a problem. There are other ways that we can achieve a desired result. With respect to the issue of affordable housing, there is, of course, the construction of new housing. There is the rehabilitation of existing housing that may not be of habitable condition at this point. There's also the alternative of simply saying that we're going to institute rent control. And some of those may not be applicable in certain circumstances and certain environments, but the reality is there's more than one way to address the housing problem. It is a supply and demand issue at its core. And so the question is, how do you work with that balance and try to achieve that balance in supply and demand to where you can bring supply in a position where you reduce demand to a point that you can reduce the cost of it? That's really the challenge. And there's a lot of different ways that you can achieve that. You also, once you have an idea of what the policy is that you're trying to recommend and you have identified the alternatives, then of course, you need to determine the criteria. How are you going to go about conducting the analysis? This is something that you really have to think about. It's not as simple as simply weighing the cost to the benefits. It's saying to yourself, how do we approach it? This is very important to consider, because you could choose to go with a very quantified, mechanical quantitative value approach, looking at from a pure monetary perspective, and that does happen a lot. And that can leave out of consideration other things that are not necessarily of a monetary value. We especially see this with respect to the issue of equity, in terms of how we have to look at those matters as we try to apply equity more in our processes in public administration. And so you're really trying to figure out, how do you go about determining what the cost and benefits are? Then you go to the process of estimating those costs and benefits. And it would be naive of me to simply say that there's a singular way of doing that. You really kind of have to go out there and figure out the best approach of estimation of value with respect to cost and benefits for a given circumstance. The good news is there's plenty of resources out there that'll show you that. There's some information that's shared in the Snell text, and there's a lot of information that's out there online, because you kind of have to look at it from a given perspective. For example, one of the challenges that I have in my work, because I oversee capital budgeting, is working with our staff on determining the cost of construction projects. We typically don't build anything ourselves, so we're totally dependent upon outside contractors to build our facilities or do renovations or those type of work. And one of the challenges you're going to have in that is being able to estimate what those costs are. We have to develop some kind of decent estimation before we put it out to bid. We have to bid everything out because we're government. We have to do that. It's important for us to do. It's necessary for us to do. You want to have an idea of what those costs are going to be. And so kind of initially when you go through it, you can do a back of the envelope analysis using cost estimation tools that are available online. But as you move forward in a project and you try to firm it up and you try to make the further case, yes, we need to proceed with this, you have to bring in somebody who has the knowledge and the skill, who does this for a living, to give you a better idea of what those costs are going to be, whether it be an architect, an engineer, or somebody who has experience in the construction trade, who has a knowledge of what costs are in the present market and where they may be 6 months, 9 months from now, which has been a huge challenge for us here of late because of inflation effect on building materials and also on labor, and be able to give you a relatively accurate cost. Because when you sell it, when you present it, I shouldn't say sell, but when you present it to elected officials, to senior staff, to make the decision as to whether to proceed with a given project involving construction, you have to give them a reliable estimate of what those costs are going to be. You build in a contingency, typically 10%, the idea that things are going to cost, maybe there is possibility that costs are going to be higher than what you expect. But if you exceed that contingency, that's a serious problem. You've not done your job in really effectively determining what the costs are going to be. So that is something that we have to keep into consideration. And at the same time, benefits also have to be estimated. You have to figure out, like, for example, if we were building a community center, how many people would this serve? In what ways would it serve? What value would you create by providing that additional benefit to the residents of your community? And you have to figure out a way of estimating what those benefits are going to be. And then once you've estimated with it, then you have to go about weighing those costs and benefits, because it's important to understand that when you're looking at your costs and you're looking at your benefits, that not necessarily will they carry equal weight. That is something that a lot of times is a mistake in cost benefit analysis, is to treat everything of the same weight and not to understand, particularly on the benefit side, it's also true on the cost side, that there's different weights or different levels of value in the total equation that they deserve. Like, I'll give you an example. A lot of times when you're expanding services that require capital investment, there is a lack of tendency to really considering how this affects future operating costs. So you look at this large investment that you've got to make up front with respect to the capital investment. And I'll give you an example: expanding your fire operations to include a new fire station. You've got to build the fire station. You've got to potentially buy additional apparatus or fire trucks. You've got to equip it. And that's a very expensive proposition in today's marketplace. Doing all of that we're looking at doing that here in Rocky Mount, and that could be $5 to $6 million, which is a significant amount of money. The reality, though, is that investment, you're going to finance it. You're likely going to use, some kind of debt instrument to finance it, and you're going to pay it over 10 to 20 years. And so those costs smoothed out over that period of time through debt payments aren't that significant. The real impact that you're going to see is in your operating costs, because you have to staff the fire department, which means for us, that means you're adding 12 additional firefighters to your operation. So you have to factor in the salary and the benefit costs of those firefighters, as well as all the other additional costs of maintaining that new station at a level consistent with your existing stations. And what I've tried to explain to them, it's not really the $5 or $6 million up front that concern me. It's the $1 million to $1.5 million per year that we're going to have to take into consideration with respect to operating costs on an annual basis. And those costs will, of course, grow over time with salaries going up and with other costs going up. And that's really where the cost is for us. So I would weigh the operating cost greater than the initial capital cost of starting it up for the nature of that organization. In certain cases, the capital cost may be more of a consideration than the operating cost, but the operating cost in a lot of things that we do in the public sector, because particularly when it comes to service expansion, really have to be carefully considered. And so you wouldn't weigh them equally. You would actually put more weight on the operating cost in those cases. Benefits is the same way. You may there are those times where you're providing services to the broad population or to the population in general. And then there are also times where you have to look at it from the perspective of providing services to a specific element of the population, a specific group within the population, whether it could be, services to seniors or those with disabilities. You have to take into consideration that the value of those benefits is potentially greater than the value of benefits to the general population. And so you have to weigh those benefits, because that's the intent of the policy. That's the intent of the plan of action. So these are things that you have to take into consideration. Then you also have to evaluate, uncertainty. There's no guarantee that a policy or a course of action is going to achieve the desired outcome. There are certain degrees of probability or percentages of probability that you can represent, like, for example, with the fire station. If you're growing your population or you're growing your service area and you need to expand fire services, there's a high degree of probability that adding a fire station is going to improve or enable you to maintain a standardized level of service with respect to response times and and handling of call volume and those type of things. That's a highly probable outcome. It's not guaranteed, however. It's kind of the challenge that we've seen with school construction. Wake County has gone through a considerable amount of school construction over the last 15 years and is continuing that. It's not as fast of a pace as it was, but it was at a considerable pace for a significant period of time. And the real question that has to be asked is this serving the students? Are we maintaining the quality level of education that we're supposed to be maintaining for our students? And the other challenge is where these schools are being built and how these schools are being distributed geographically within the county. How will those locations match up to where future students are residing, perhaps a generation from now or 2 generations from now? And what will be the outcomes as a result of that? And that's where you also have to factor in that there's a range of outcomes that could occur. Ideally, you want to have a policy that is most likely to achieve a desired outcome, but it's entirely possible that multiple outcomes could be achieved, including outcomes that are better than what's anticipated, and also certainly outcomes that are worse than anticipated. One of the examples that comes to mind in recent years has been efforts in public transportation to build downtown oriented systems to try to encourage central city use of public transportation, mass transportation, to reduce vehicle use of single occupant vehicles or small vehicles. One example that comes to mind in recent years is they actually they established and built out a streetcar in Washington, D.C. They built this streetcar to try to facilitate some connectivity on above ground between certain points in the central area of Washington, D.C. And they spent a considerable amount of money on it. They built out the network. They installed the cars. They had them running on the roads. And they thought that by creating a service that would be perceived to be of a higher level, that it would encourage ridership, that it would reduce the volume of small vehicles, particularly for commuting and for inner city commuting and going from office to office. What they found was it didn't do any of that. Nobody really wanted to take the streetcar. There were problems with the streetcar and its position within the road system because it was on the roads. It caused accidents. They simply were never achieving any of the outcomes that were desired, and they ended up canceling the project. They ended up basically just pulling it off the street after a considerable investment of local and federal money to do that. And this is obviously this is the worst possible outcome of a major investment, but it is something that has to be taken into consideration. So the ideal, of course, is that possibility would have been considered in the cost benefit analysis, that you have to have, particularly when you're trying something experimental or you're trying something that's not conventional, you have to be honest with the possibility that it's not going to work. It's kind of like the idea that was presented during COVID, to this idea that was presented that maybe with respect to grocery stores, we can help potentially reduce the spread by encouraging one-way traffic through shopping aisles. And so, particularly if you went to a Food Lion, they were the ones who tried to be the most clear about this. They put up a tremendous amount of signage and pathway and all kinds of communication to encourage people to walk through the grocery store one way and alternate aisles. And generally speaking, it was not successful. And I don't know specifically about how that policy evaluation, the development of the analysis went through. There wasn't a tremendous amount of cost put into it. It wasn't an expensive proposition. It was perhaps a noble attempt. I have a feeling that there was some consideration that it would not be successful, but it was worth trying. And so they went through it. My experience with the Food Lions here in our area was that nobody was really paying attention to it. It was, forcing them to change their habit and the way in which they went through the grocery store, and people just were not interested in changing their habits. And staff at these grocery stores were not interested in enforcing it simply because it creates a uncomfortable interaction with your customer. Businesses do not like to create uncomfortable interactions with their customers. And so that was kind of what happened. Once you've gone through all of that, then of course you have the responsibility to apply the criteria and put together, once you've gathered all your information, you've gathered all your costs, you've gathered all your benefits, you've weighed them, you've taken into consideration the uncertainty and outcomes, and you've taken into consideration the alternatives and try to evaluate those as well, then you have to apply it. And you basically apply the manner in which you want to proceed with this analysis, and that leads to your result. And then based on however criteria you use and determining on how you do it, it gives you an idea. do the benefits outweigh the cost? And if the benefits outweigh the cost, then that can move the policy along. If the cost outweigh the benefits, then there's the possibility that you have to reconsider what the policy is. But you want to try to go through this tabletop simulation to be able to determine if the policy is worth pursuing. That can be a considerable challenge. And that's something we have to do in order to be able to develop good policy. So when you're developing and trying to value cost and benefits, it's very important to find a common unit of measurement and or common units of measurement. And it's very important when you're doing an analysis that you can tie both the cost and the benefits in a way that you can achieve a common unit of measurement, whether that be in the terms of population, a response time, going back to the fire department example, and of course, dollars. There are two different types of cost benefit analysis that we do. First, there's of course the investment-based cost benefit analysis. Do you choose to make an investment in the recommended policy or the investigated policy, I should say? And that's a binary yes or no decision. That's what the analysis will tell you. Do you make the investment? And that's an important consideration to make. Then there are those types of cost benefit analysis that are design oriented. And this is where you're looking at multiple possibilities, more than one option, and you recognize that there is a problem that has to be addressed with policy or a course of action. And you're basically trying to decide which policy is the best. It's an either or situation, and it could be two, it could be more than two. You're really trying to look at, what is the best option of many to consider. And that is of course a challenge in itself. There are ways of looking at, how we do CBA. The financial model is of course the most straightforward one. It looks at, how much is spent and how much is received. And of course, this is used exclusively almost by the private sector when they do cost benefit analysis. When they're looking at it, they're looking at what's the return on investment. For every dollar we're putting in, how much money are we getting back? And that's understandable because if there's a profit, it's profit motive. There's no question about that. And it can, of course, get very dark and very dismal in terms of how it's approached, but it is the way it's done. Then you have the economic approach where you're looking at it from a perspective of efficiency. Dollars per unit of service, dollars per unit of benefit. And that's a lot of times the way we look at it in the public sector, because again, we're not driven by profit, we're driven by service, but we still have to be focused on achieving efficiency. And so, for example, in public transportation, the most common measurement that is used to track the efficiency of public transportation operations is dollars per mile per passenger. Basically, you take the route, you've got your cost, you've got your cost of service, and then on the cost side, and then on the benefit side, you've got the miles of service that you're providing, the miles of network that you're covering with your transit service, and you've got your passenger count. You multiply those together, you then divide your costs into that, and that gives you an efficiency ratio, which is primarily how public transit is looked at. And it can be, in some cases, it can be very low, particularly in highly dense areas that have that serve a lot of people. You think of New York City or Washington, D.C. with the metro subway system, or Boston or Chicago. And then when you're going into other kinds of service, like bus service, or particularly the special transportation services that are provided for people with disabilities or for senior citizens, those costs are going to go up because that's a more unique type of service. And needless to say, it's going to serve fewer passengers and potentially service a smaller area in terms of the mileage of service covered. And so the ratio is going to be higher, but you tend to expect that. And so you're looking at the different ways you can provide that specific service, and you try to pick what's the most efficiency. Then, as we move in the public sector, along with considering from an economic perspective, we should also consider it also from a social perspective. And that's where prices are adjusted in terms of their value from a cost and benefit perspective. And this also gets into the consideration of equity. We look at trying to help people overcome institutional or social or cultural challenges that exist in our society. There is a likelihood that those have to be weighed differently, because if you compare them at equal weight to, say, a more conventional practice, it's not going to look as attractive. The reality is that you have to consider who you're serving and why you're serving them and what the goal is in order to really be able to effectively weigh it in an appropriate manner and adjust it accordingly to achieve social goals. That the social value, the social value to the individual or to the segment of the population you're serving takes a precedence in the valuation to the cost itself. And that is something that we're still working on. We're still working on trying to effectively be able to communicate that, because at the end of the day, we have to remember that while we can expand resources that are available through taxation, through increasing money supply, or through dedication of additional resources with respect to public policy issues, we're still going to always have a climate where resources are always going to some degree be limited. You can expand the pie, but at some point the pie can only be so big. So you have to be mindful of that. One example that I read, I believe it was done in Dallas, but I could be wrong. But it was dealing with looking at how community centers operated in certain neighborhoods, and a decision was made to, instead of all the community centers in this city, I think it was Dallas, I could be wrong, they chose instead to shift the operating hours based on the location. So in some cases, community centers in more affluent or more stable neighborhoods actually saw their hours reduced. And what that allowed them to do was then it allowed the Parks and Rec department that was overseeing them to be able to shift budgets and shift funding allocations, because their budgets were restricted. It allowed them to shift those resources to community centers in neighborhoods that were more distressed and that needed the presence of these centers to provide opportunities to residents who could not find them through other means. It allowed them to actually open their centers longer. So that's the kind of solution that we're having to look at. And you have to, and of course, that does lead to potentially in the mind of some people an unequal service delivery, because you could say, well, this community center is only, before, let's just say community centers were open 70 hours a week. They were open 10 hours a day, 7 days a week. Now you've got a situation where some community centers are being only open, let's say 50 hours a week. And then other community centers are being open 80 to 90 hours a week. And some people would look at that and say, well, that's unequal service delivery. The reality, though, is then you present it from the standpoint of benefits and says, well, we're trying to achieve an equality with respect to outcome. And what we see is that we can achieve that, we can redistribute those resources. And obviously there's going to be people and in groups that don't agree with that. So this is not an argument for or against it. There is a reality, however, that certain resources, that if you have limited resources and you're trying to achieve benefit, you're trying to increase the benefit for those who need the resources most, you're choosing to prioritize the distribution of those resources to prioritize the benefit, that's something that has to be considered. And so you have to look at it more from a social method, because you have to make the case, and you have to be prepared to make the case. They're going to be in any evaluation, when you're dealing with trying to reallocate resources on the basis of need, or on the basis of trying to provide the greatest benefit to those who are perhaps in need of the greatest benefit, you have to be able to make an effective case for it. You can't just, you have to show it in a manner and in a way that those who may be opposed to it from the basis of, well, we want to see that everyone gets the same benefit, can understand the value of it. It's very important. Otherwise, you're going to find yourself in a situation where they're not going to be as accepting of the calculation of the valuation, and are going to remain opposed to it. And of course, that creates division, which can be a potential negative outcome of the policy, even if the policy is able to achieve positive results and able to create the benefit. You don't have the buy-in, you haven't addressed the political or philosophical issues which could further undermine the policy going forward. And so this kind of ties into the value judgment aspect when we're doing the analysis. We have to make sure how we approach that is the right way, could potentially be the wrong way. Is the policy right or wrong? And then obviously we also have to figure out, is it useful? And this is something we have to be mindful of, particularly because in public policy, every time there is going to be a cost borne on the government, borne on the citizens as taxpayers or as utility customers or as people paying fees for service. There is going to be a cost, and you have to be able to explain and establish utility to some extent, that you have to establish that there is an outcome that is useful, maybe not to people individually, but to society. A lot of times, for example, when you're looking at certain kinds of investments that are made by the public sector, you may find, and this has come up at times with schools, but it also comes up with community centers, the event center we built in Rocky Mount, and other investments. There are going to be residents to say, well, that's not useful to me. Why do I have to, as a citizen, pay for it? And it happens with parks. You have to know, and you have to be able to effectively communicate and show with your work that you are achieving a useful result for this community as a whole. And that is a challenge that you're always going to have, no matter what jurisdiction. It may be to greater or lesser degree, depending on where you're working and what area of service you're providing, but it is something that you are always going to have to deal with. And effective cost benefit analysis enables you to overcome that obstacle most times. Doesn't necessarily make everybody happy. At the end of the day, you're not going to make everybody happy. What you're trying to do is enable everybody to understand it. They may still not like the outcome, they still may not agree with you, but at least you've given them the opportunity to understand what you're trying to do and what you're trying to accomplish. So now we're going to go into the discussion of problem definition, and this gets to what's covered in chapter 1 of the Jiva and Bildovsky text. And there are some key concepts that I wanted to just cover with respect to this. And I have the text here that I may reference back to. When we're trying to solve a problem, the manner in which they suggest, and I'm not saying that this is something that is achieved every time, but it does happen a lot. And it is something that you can do, is you want to approach it. First of all, you do want to be creative. in the course of any work that humans try to do, um, particularly when we're trying to solve problems or we're trying to, um, achieve results, we have a natural tendency to be creative, to want to be creative and inventive in our approach. And there's nothing wrong with that. So um, you want to be able to approach the problem inventively. And as they suggest here, you want to try to do it backwards. You want to have a concept of what the solution is and then work back to the problem. Um, that can be seen as counterintuitive to some people. Um, there are a lot of people who look at problem solving more, identify the problem and then solve it. But when you think about in public policy where we have achieved perhaps the greatest success, both planned and unplanned, it has been with this backward approach. I used the moonshot example from the 1960s, I think earlier in class. President Kennedy sets out this goal at a time when our space program was still basically in its infancy in terms of manned space flight, and says, and this was in 1961, says, within a 9-year period, 8 to 9 year period of time, I want us to go to the moon and return. At that time, we had only managed to simply launch an astronaut up into space, have them up there for 15 minutes, and then have them come back down safely through reentry. So we hadn't even orbited the Earth at this point. So the president sets out a goal or an objective of what the solution is going to look like, what the outcome is going to look like. And of course, there's a whole series of problems, you get a whole series of outcomes you've got to achieve before you get to that. So you basically identify Z, you're at point Z, you're at point A, and you realize, and this gets back to incrementalism, there's a whole series of incremental approaches, incremental steps that you have to take, a whole series of policies that you have to achieve in order to be able to result in Z. And we were generally successful in that regard. Now, you also look at what happened with Apollo 13. And if you've watched the Ron Howard movie with Tom Hanks in it, there's the scene where the mission control staff is in the conference room, and the lead character, Ed Harris's character, I forget the man's real name, is saying that the goal is for them to return safely. And he makes it very clear. He says, okay, where are they now? How do we get them back? How do we get them back in a way that they will not run out of air, run out of electricity, run out of the resources that they need to be able to land effectively? And it's an incremental process. It's got an overarching comprehensive goal, but it's an incremental process to achieve there. And the movie does a great job of showing, and it's dramatized to a degree, but showing the steps that are necessary to achieve this. But at the end of the day, they're working backwards. They've started out at the end. They have the end in mind, and they're trying to inventively, and there's some great examples shown in the movie of where they had to be extremely inventive to be able to solve some of the problems that they had throughout the course of the rescue, to be able to achieve this result. And of course, they were successful. Now, when we're also defining problems, we also want to keep in mind that, generally speaking, most policy situations we're facing where policy is needed, have happened before. Doesn't mean we shouldn't be creative. It also means that we need to be cognizant and aware of history. And that means that there's that famous line in Ocean's 11 where Elliot Gould says, "It's been tried," when they were talking about, robbing from a casino. He goes, "It's been tried." And I always think of that anytime somebody comes into a room to offer a solution, I want to say, just kind of backhandedly, "It's been tried," not to discourage them, but to simply say, make sure you understand, it's not that you may think this is the first time we've looked at this. It's not. We've looked at it before, or it's been looked at before. And the reality is that there have been attempts to try to establish policy to solve these problems that you've identified, that to try to solve these problems to achieve certain outcomes, and they haven't worked. More than likely, the reason why you're looking at it is because it hasn't been solved yet. And so we know what those attempts were. Why did they not work? Why have other solutions failed? That has to be factored into consideration. And then something else, and this is important, particularly, I would say it's something that we don't ask ourselves enough, in that when we're creative, we have to remember that there are limitations. And it's important to keep them in mind. Now, obviously, and so you have to ask yourself, what cannot be done? And I would suggest that there's a couple of different ways you have to look at this. What cannot be done from the standpoint of resource availability? For example, if you know that that there's a financial limit to how much you can spend to achieve a certain outcome with a policy, you can't go over it. For, if I, like when we built the event center, one of the first things we did was we brought in a financial advisor to give us an idea of what our debt capacity was. We knew we were going to have to finance this facility. We had a general idea of what it was going to cost. And we needed to know, could we afford it? And they came to us, they did their analysis, and they said, you can afford this much. And so that gave us an idea of how much we could afford. We couldn't do more than we could afford, but we could afford a certain amount. And that was still with a tax increase. But we knew we could afford it if we could get the buy-in from council to achieve it, that we knew we could do this. And so we worked within those parameters. I would also say that something you also have to factor in is legality and constitutionality. You have to make sure that the policy, you have to do your best to make sure, first of all, what you're doing is legal or does not require a considerable change in law to achieve. Sometimes a change in law is necessary through the legislative process, but you want it to be something that can be accomplished incrementally, because the amount of political capital and the political risk associated with a transformational change to law can be a tremendous impediment to the ability of the policy to be implemented. So going back to the Affordable Care Act of 2010, Congress had to make some considerable changes to the law to be able to achieve this policy goal of a comprehensive availability of insurance, the goal being comprehensive availability of insurance for everyone. And this was a radical transformational change in healthcare law. And those who voted for it, i.e. the Democrats, they voted for it. They also had to be cognitively aware that this was likely going to result in the loss of their majority's control of Congress in the 2010 election. That was the result that happened. The only thing that they could take solace in is that by passing the law, or passing the laws, it was all done together, but it was really a series of law changes, that they had created enough momentum for the policy that even though the Republicans were able to run against it and were able to win in the midterm election in 2010 and regain control of the House and Senate, that they found themselves in a position where they could not effectively reverse it. There is kind of a momentum that is achieved in public policy as steps are taken, where if you're able to put something in, chances are it's going to be very difficult to remove it from a legal perspective. Government grows its portfolio, it hardly ever shrinks it. Very rarely does government shrink portfolios in terms of the services it provides or the programs that it offers, and that can create its own problems. What I'm also saying is that politicians, the more astute ones, realize that there is benefit in getting something through, even if there is a short-term political negative political consequence to it, because the chances of it being reversed are very limited. But then there's also the constitutional consideration that we have to make here in the United States and other parts of the world as well. But I can speak to the one with respect to constitutional consideration here domestically. There are a lot of policies, particularly when we look at policies that are implemented and applied around the world, that have the potential to create positive outcomes and achieve positive results. But they are likely not to be easily implemented as a result of the constitutional limitations we have on government, particularly national government here in the United States. The policy decision that was made by President Biden with respect to student loan forgiveness, is now being challenged by multiple states. They're using tax liability issues as the primary argument against it, the injury that's created to be able to establish judicial standing. But they're challenging it because they're arguing, well, the president really doesn't have the right to do this on their own. It has to go to Congress. Congress is not interested in proceeding with it because there are significant negative political ramifications because of the general public debate or how the public debate's been framed about this issue. And so they went ahead with executive action. But the reality is that it's a considerable constitutional challenge. So we have to be aware of the constitutionality. Now, it does not mean that just because something is constitutional doesn't mean it won't be challenged. If you can make a constitutional argument that can be defended, then you do have the ability through the necessary and proper clause and through other elements of the Constitution to be able to expand policy to serve certain benefits from where it is currently. You still have to be aware of it. You still have to be cognizant of it because our Constitution is intended to be less explicit about what government, it was intended, the founders intended it to be explicit about what the federal government could do. Subsequent amendments and interpretations by the Supreme Court and other elements of the judicial branch have suggested, well, they did kind of give some ability to expand the power of government, and those have been used to expand it. And then, of course, we've had the amendment process, which has also expanded the role of federal government, particularly the establishment of the 14th Amendment. And so there are things that we have to consider, but we still need to make sure that there is a constitutional argument. And this is especially true with federal policy. When it comes to state and local policy, you obviously have to follow state law, local ordinances, state constitution, local charters. Those things have to be taken into consideration. And that's especially important to remember in a right to work, not a right to work state. We are a right to work state, but in a Dillon rule state like North Carolina, if you're working in local policy, because local policies are restricted to the powers that are granted to localities by the states. That's something to remember because we're a Dillon's rule state, that our authority at the local level is explicitly granted by the state. We can't just assume that power. We have to work within the parameters that were provided. And those times, like going back to housing, there was an effort made, I believe it was by Winston-Salem a couple of years back, that they thought that they had the authority to be able to establish a policy to require that all rental units be inspected on a regular basis. So they wanted to establish a process by which if you ran rental housing that you had to get a permit, and that enabled them to provide inspection, because generally speaking, when it comes to rental property in North Carolina, and this is the case in many states, the process by which rental property is inspected is a complaint-driven process, which puts tenants in a very uncomfortable position with respect to making complaints about the conditions of their units, because they would initiate it, which means then the landlord knows that they initiated it, and theoretically, if the landlord's not happy with them initiating it, it gives them grounds for um, retaliation. By making it to where the city simply says, well, we're going to require you to get inspected, that takes the tenant out of the equation, takes the landlord out of the equation. It basically says that it's a way of trying to officiate that relationship. Well, the General Assembly in North Carolina, after hearing from landlords primarily, said, well, we didn't give you this power, and now we're going to explicitly forbid you from doing it. So they basically they pass laws pretty quickly to basically said, we're going to take that authority away from you, and we're also going to not allow you to be able, from Winston-Salem, and we're not going to allow any city to be able to do this going forward. So you also, and of course, this thing gets to something else you have to consider, along with, you know, legal and constitutional limitations. You also have to consider the underlying substantive political concerns. And I would strongly encourage this in today's polarized political environment. When I was going through, as I said, I think I talked about this before. I started my MPA program in the fall of 2001. That, of course, was a dramatically different time than it is now, and we are in an era where there is a tremendous amount of distrust, and I would say it's distrust from the left and right, of what government does. And we have to be aware of that. And we have to be aware that that distrust can come many different ways. There could be people who don't want the government to do anything because they think the government doesn't do anything right. And there are also those who want the government to do things, want them to implement policies to address certain problems, but they are not comfortable, or they don't believe, based on past experience with government, that government's doing it the right way. And so, you know, one of the key things that we're learning now is that we have to do a better job of preliminary engagement with the public. We have to take the time and the resources to make sure that, if particularly we are going to help specific populations, that we simply don't just craft a policy and say, this is what we're going to do for you. There is a stronger desire now that it be a more inclusive process where citizens are engaged with early on in the actual development of the policy. And this is not an easy thing to do, because you have to work together, and teamwork is always a challenge, but there is a need for it. And then also we have to take into consideration the general values of those we serve. We have, that's going to be another limitation on our creativity and inventiveness, is you have, and that's again where incrementalism comes into play. Radical change is harder to achieve because oftentimes it runs counter to the general values of a given organization. Now, a given community. We have to be aware of that. So those are things we have to take into consideration. And so all of this comes together in order to be able to define the problem as we are working to identify what the outcome is, and then trying to figure out how the problem is going to be defined. We have to be aware of the context and actors involved. So we have to be very aware today of context, understanding, you know, what we're saying and how it's going to be interpreted. And those contexts can have organizational elements, and they can also be political. And it's not, don't look at politics purely from a liberal or conservative perspective, or right or left. Look at it from the perspective of whatever it is that's what's going on in the mindset of those you're trying to serve, or those that are involved in policy implementation. That chances are in working in policy, you may sometimes deal with individuals. Most of the time you're dealing with constituencies and movements, and that is a challenge. When it comes to identifying those actors that are involved, it's important to understand not just who they are, but how and why they're involved. What are their motivations and their beliefs? Um, you know, understanding their history, their background in a given situation. Did they personally experience wrongdoing that has led them to be an advocate or an actor? Um, that is important because it helps you understand why this may be so personal for them or why they have certain viewpoints that they carry. Um, Also understanding the resources that they have at their disposal or the resources that they've cultivated, as well as their effectiveness. Can they be effective? Are they effective? And then, understanding the physicality of it, location, the sites. Um, when you're like, when you're working in many parts of the South, a lot of culture, particularly in impoverished areas, still revolves around churches. And so, but at the same time, you have to be careful with that. Obviously, there are going to be stronger churches and weaker churches. And at the same time, people are going to, even within a neighborhood or in a given community, are going to have preferences with respect to which churches you work for. They may like some churches and dislike other churches, just like other institutions. And so you have to be aware of that because you always want to make sure that whenever you're advocating or advancing policy, that you're doing so in a positive and meaningful way. As we move forward in trying to understand these contexts and actors, it's really important to look at them as to really emphasize and focus on the needs of who you're trying to serve, who you're trying to provide benefit to. And in this case, I mean, they refer to it here as the client. There are a lot of times actors who may not necessarily be clients. They may represent them. The client may not feel that they're able to represent themselves, or they may have delegated representation to an actor. But it's important to remember that at the end, that the solution is dependent on benefiting the client. And so whether it's with the client directly or through the actor that they are working with that represents them, it's in order to engage them, it's important to clarify, what you're trying to achieve and probe critically together, do it in a critical process. That does not mean to be critical of them. It means to be critical from the standpoint of actually trying to figure out what the solution is. This gets to trying to treat, use a medical reference, treating the illness or what's really going on instead of just purely the symptoms of it. Also understand you as an analyst are going to think differently than a politician. Motives are different. Outcomes are different. It's all different. That there's really nothing shocking about that. That analysts and politicians think differently, and that's perfectly fine. That's part of it. And so I would say in terms of how you work with politicians, it's important to do your best to remain neutral, to find ways to constructively and yet non-emotionally advocate for what you are proposing, to do so in a matter-of-fact and professional way, not to make it personal, and to respect and understand the manner in which a politician is going to evaluate it. And if they bring forth concerns or things that they need to factor into their decision making that perhaps you haven't thought of or that are more challenging for you to incorporate, to acknowledge them, respect them, and then work to help them find what they need to know. It's important, and this is something that I have to keep in mind at all times in my work, is that regardless of whether or not I agree personally in my own mind with whatever a politician says that I serve, I have to believe, and I will always believe, that they are doing what they believe is best to truly benefit the interest of those they represent. Now, given some examples that we see throughout history and in the present, that can be a very naive way of looking at the world. You have to maintain that mentality, because you are there to serve them. You are there to serve the citizens, the population of whatever jurisdiction that you're involved in. And obviously, as a nonprofit, you're serving your clients. So you have to maintain. I think you have to maintain that mentality. And obviously, the more that you can effectively and constructively incorporate public participation, the better off you are. You want there to be buy-in, and participation is key to buy-in. When it comes to identifying policy goals, they need to be explicit, but the goals themselves, it's important not to confuse them with the policy itself. The policy may be more challenging to explain, but still you have to. So really being able to identify the goals and tie the policy to them, but don't confuse them with the policy itself. The goals are really what the outcome is, and it's the policies and it's the purpose of the policy to achieve them. And then also, as we say, with any type of policy or any type of action, there are going to be trade-offs. And it's important, as you're looking at the cost and benefits, to identify what those trade-offs are going to be and make sure that you understand their impact, and that to the best of your ability, be able to communicate that impact to politicians, to senior staff, as well as to the public that's being served. That's important to do as well. You don't want to ever find yourself being accused of hiding something. That doesn't mean that you're necessarily clairvoyant or going to be able to anticipate everything. And most politicians and people understand that. And at the same time, it's important to your best that if there are particularly significant trade-offs, they need to be effectively communicated as much in advance, that people need to have that understanding, and that they need to be documented. When it comes, then of course, there's going to be all the variables you have to consider in defining problems. It's good to ask for help. If you can find those within an organization, going back to, things have been tried before, going back and trying to find people who have the institutional memory within the place you're serving, or who can provide perspective from other places, those are important. And what you want to try to do when you're talking about alternatives, particularly in saying why example a given policy would be better than alternatives, is to try to identify the historic analogies where those alternatives have been tried in the past and have not necessarily yielded the same results that you believe can be achieved through the policy you're recommending. And again, drawing from the experience of others, those with institutional memory or institutional knowledge who can share that information. When it comes to, that's important to identify with those variables. However, it's also important that when you're factoring in these variables that could have an influence on the success or failure of policy, that you scrutinize them and you try to limit them to the most likely. It's very easy to fall down a rabbit hole when it comes to looking at variables, because anything's possible, anything can happen. And you really want to focus on those that are really pertinent to what you're looking at. So you want to make sure to eliminate those that do not impact the policy or necessarily change philosophy. You want it to kind of make it consistent with those variables that are tied. You want to eliminate those that do not impact policy. You want to eliminate those that are not necessarily impacting policy or that are changing philosophy. You want to make sure those are out. And also, when it comes to then establishing variables, you want to have value ranges. You want to have some flexibility, but not too much. And then as you work and identify the variables, they need to be grouped. so that you can enable what your options are with respect to policy in terms of maybe different policies, or maybe the manner in which the different manners or approaches in which you can choose to implement a policy. Also, when you're identifying a problem, you have to factor in the degree of complexity. Once you've kind of got an idea of what the problem is, it's important to examine general and specific aspects of the problem. The mixed scanning approach that they talk about in the text, looking over different aspects from different perspectives, but don't force yourself into generic classifications. Don't force yourself into generic classifications when you're looking at the complexity. Data gathering, there's all different types of data to gather, and the list there, you have historic data, basic data, political, projections, contacts, and others. You should and can play creatively with the development of other types of data. Just don't put yourself in a situation where you find yourself, it's very easy to get bogged down in data. There's tons of data out there. A lot of it's useful, much of it isn't, and you can easily find yourself spending all your time looking at data that has marginal impact with respect to your decision. You obviously want to do your best to canvass as many sources as possible, but it's important to remain objective. And that does not mean that all the sources out there have to prove themselves to be impartial or unbiased. What it means is that you need to remain objective and test for yourself their validity and objectivity. There are many organizations out there, particularly in the think tank community, that do kind of lean politically one way or another. They do a lot of important work. They do a lot of important data gathering. So you kind of, if you choose to use from those sources, you have to be mindful of what they are, of their methods. And if they can provide validity and certainty in their methods, then you can use them. However, if it appears that what they're just simply trying to do is put together a set of data to prove what they want to prove, then don't use them. And this gets back to checking sources. You have to carefully choose and justify the period baseline. Like, for example, when we've had a lot of volatility in the last couple of years. So when you're looking at trying to do baselines for policy in the present, for example, I would not, if I was looking at employment data or inflation or other things that I was trying to address through policy, I would not look at where we were at the end of 2020. The baseline that I would set would probably be the end of 2019, because that was pre-pandemic. And I would want to know, where are we compared to where we were before the pandemic? Because in the prior pandemic period, economically, we had a certain degree of stability and certainty, and we were in a positive trajectory. So there was a decent environment there. And then, of course, everything radically changed as a result of the pandemic. So using, even now would not be an appropriate time to set a baseline. You would want to see, where are you before the pandemic, understanding that the pandemic can create a tremendous amount of volatility and shock, and is going to distort results, and it's going to create a challenging baseline. Now, if you're talking about how do we address deficiencies that still exist, you still want to make sure that you've got that baseline so you can see where you were compared to now. So you have to be very careful about that. And this gets to the fact that facts can be deceptive. You have to have perspective with respect to what facts say, because facts can be deceptive. A fact is an observation, but that observation, without proper context, without proper consideration, can deceive people. And we deal with that pretty regularly, and it's something that we have to overcome. So I hope that this is kind of a good synopsis of what's covered in chapter 1 of the Jiva and Vildovsky book on problem definition. And I hope this kind of gives you an idea of what to think about as you're working to define the problem that that provides the justification for the policy that you seek to implement. So now we're going to go back to Snell, chapter 2, quantifying and valuing cost and benefits. As I talked about before, there's a tendency that we have to always want to do something. But when we're doing cost benefit analysis, we have to be cognizant of the fact that there is always the option of doing nothing. That gets ridiculed a lot, but it is a realistic consideration we have to make. And so what we have to do is be very mindful that when we're doing cost benefit analysis and we're valuing cost and benefits, that we're making sure to look at what happens if we do something, i.e. with project or with policy, as opposed to without it. Those are things we have to make sure that we're taking that into consideration. For example, when we did the event center, it's entirely possible there could easily be said, you know, the problem that we defined as a result of building the event center was that we still had an environment of underinvestment in our downtown area, a lack of economic opportunity in our downtown area and in surrounding neighborhoods of downtown. And the question you have to ask yourself when you're doing a cost benefit analysis, okay, we're looking to make this investment and build a facility to facilitate investment, to encourage investment, to draw attention to our downtown. Well, what would happen if we did absolutely nothing? What would happen if we didn't build the event center? You know, what would life be like then? And then you have to look at the difference between doing nothing and doing something. There are things you have to take into consideration. You know, one is the transfer payments consideration. There is a tendency, and this is especially true in economic analysis, that people look at, you know, economic growth associated with investment, but they fail to take into consideration whether that's truly created or whether it's transferred from one activity to another. This is especially true in the economic analysis associated with professional sports stadiums. There's a criticism that's made of them that while they do actually create some economic growth, what you're really doing is you're taking disposable income from people who could be spending it one way, and instead you're encouraging them to spend it a different way. That's an example of a transfer payment. You also, as I've talked about many times before, and this is very important to me, have to look at the externalities. What are the unintended consequences, positive and negative, of a given situation? Particularly when it comes to capital projects that involve a capital investment, you have to factor what those sunk costs are. You know, what is it that you're not able to recover? You know, if you're going to build an event center, that's a $40 million investment, and that's a sunk cost. And there's the potential, there is the potential. I mean, obviously that can only be used once. It's sunk into it. It's non-transferable. And you have to take into consideration the value of that. And depending on the type of analysis you're doing, that may put an even higher value on that amount of money that you're putting in. Obviously, you have to work with best estimates and factor in contingencies, both that tie to physical contingencies as well as the factoring of prices and inflation. You know, depreciation is something we also have to consider, and this is especially true. This is more true in the investment area, in the private sector, but it is something we have to factor from a public perspective. Infrastructure is a prime example of this. When we make infrastructure improvements or expand infrastructure, you've put that infrastructure in the ground at the sunk cost, but it depreciates. And the reason why we have to factor depreciation is that eventually there is going to be replacement or rehabilitation. And, you know, for example, one of the biggest challenges that municipalities have had for many decades now has been their water and sewer system. Most of their distribution systems were built out in the early 20th century. So these systems have been in the ground for over 100 years. And many of these systems have now reached the end of their useful life. Now, these systems were not built with any cost benefit analysis to consider back then. They were done simply to provide the benefit. And if you don't, at least as you're looking at building new systems, not necessarily replacing these systems, but when you're looking at, say, you've got a swath of land out in an exterior part of your community that you're looking at making available for residential development or mixed use development. And while the developer will be responsible for building in the internal distribution, you've got to run the necessary major lines of water and sewer to service that area. That's going to be your responsibility. You remember that you're increasing your inventory of assets, and as such, eventually, say 50, 100 years from now, those assets are going to have to be replaced. Then, of course, there is the issue of shadow pricing, which is where we translate financial cost into economic cost. Again, we talked about opportunity cost. Again, if you choose to spend $1 on one thing, there's the possibility that you're taking that money and applying it to one thing. You've got a fixed amount of money. You're taking $1, you're choosing to spend on one thing. You don't have the ability to spend it on something else. And so those opportunity costs are there, and they have to be part of your consideration. Then you also look at the economic benefits, which can be measured monetarily. They can be measured with job growth. They can be measured with pay increases, increases of community wealth or individual wealth, whatever the case may be. Now, we go now to, so that concludes Snell chapter 2. We now go back into the Bildowski text and looking at the difference between, or looking at chapter 7, opportunity cost and merit wants. It is not easy to distinguish these. We have to remember that, and I talk a lot about opportunity cost. It's a subject that a lot of people like to focus attention on, particularly those that are critical of government investment, of government spending. They like to focus on this a lot. For example, when you borrow money for a project like the event center, there are going to be those that say, well, this is going to cost us $40 million. What else could we spend our money on? What I always like to mention to them is, well, this is $40 million we were borrowing, not in cash. And so theoretically, we could just, the money was being created by us, money was being created by us by its purpose. We have a responsibility to pay for it. You could argue that the opportunity cost is the future cost of that debt, which we raise taxes for, but you have to take that into consideration. And then merit wants, of course, are their own interesting aspect because they also need to be factored into our analysis. And so we have to look at, when we look at these, it's important that we take into consideration that there's a difference in the way we can value cost and benefits. One is the intrinsic value, which is the value that it holds. Not necessarily its exchange value or the value that we can get for it in exchange for another commodity or service, good or service. The intrinsic value is the value that it holds over time. Those who advocate for gold as an asset for investment purposes talk about its intrinsic value. That gold is never worth zero. Gold is always worth something. And that price does fluctuate over time, and that people believe that gold and typically increases in its value with respect to inflation. That's certainly been the case over the last 50 years. But it's also still volatile at times, not as volatile as other investments, but still volatile. Whereas, that's the attempt that's trying to be established with cryptocurrency. They are trying to establish that by setting a fixed limit on cryptos, whether it be Bitcoin or Ethereum, that they're trying to say that it has an intrinsic value because of the way it's structured and the fact that it cannot be easily copied. It has to be mined, much like with mine gold, except through a different process. The fact is that it's supposed to hold some type of value. But at the same time, as I always like to say, the true value of any asset is when you actually have to use it. And typically that's to exchange it for something else. Land itself land, homes, cash, cars, even gold. The true value of it is when you actually need to use it to pay for something or choose it to exchange for something. And so we have to keep those in mind. When it comes particularly to public goods, we have to realize that there are a lot of public goods that maintain an intrinsic value, like infrastructure, and themselves have virtually zero exchange value because they can't be exchanged. Roads are an example. Roads have value. They do have a value and actually we account for that value as an asset from an accounting perspective, and we depreciate it. And we're supposed to theoretically be able to, like other businesses are supposed to be banking that depreciation. We don't, most don't. But the reality is that there is an intrinsic value to having public goods, but that does not necessarily mean that they have an exchange value. And that's something we have to factor in. So when we're factoring valuation and trying to determine, there's the merit, there's the utility, and there is the price of various things. And so the way by which we can facilitate this is by using cost. Cost provides us the best alternative for being able to determine value. What does it in terms of, assets or things that we do in the public space, in the public sector. So we figure out what their cost is, and whether that's the cost of construction, the replacement cost for a given item, the cost of providing the service based on various financial realities. We open up a fire station, you've got salary, you've got materials, benefits for employees, fuel for vehicles, those type of things. But cost provides us the best alternative in what we do for factoring value. And so this becomes this is why we look at everything from a cost perspective, not just the cost of what we do, but also the opportunity cost of what we're not able to do because we've allocated our resources one way as opposed to making them available for alternatives. Then we have to look at, when we talk about social wants and merit wants, we have to realize that they're different. Social wants obviously is what society wants. Merit wants are perhaps what we consider what is best, based on value. And I'll give you an example from technology. So most of you are familiar, of course, with the iPhone. It was the manifestation of a series of incremental improvements that were made in the 2000s by Steve Jobs and Apple. Jobs, once he took back over Apple, of course, Jobs started Apple in the 70s, left Apple, basically was kicked out of Apple. Apple started falling. It was actually almost to the point of bankruptcy. He came back and built Apple into the behemoth it was up until his death several years ago. And Jobs came in with Jobs, of course, had learned, he was kind of a very interesting guy in his first iteration with Apple, but in his second iteration, he was very directional and intentional with respect to what he wanted to achieve and how he wanted Apple to grow from a product perspective. And there were times where people questioned the design decisions that Apple made with respect to its products in this generation. And really, it was when they came out with the iPhone. Prior to the iPhone, there had been mobile devices that had been created. The first one that really took off was the BlackBerry, and that came up in the early 2000s and had a keyboard, a little QWERTY keyboard that you could use on it, and it had a screen. And when Jobs pushed for the iPhone, he said, we want it to where the total interface that the customer has, that the user has with the device, is purely screen-based. We don't want there to be any other thing. He wanted as much simplicity as possible in the interface. And people I remember when the first iPhone came out, they were shocked. They were like, well, why isn't there a keyboard? Why isn't there a stylus? There had been a stylus with their first mobile product, the Newton, back in the 90s. Um, you know, none of that was there. And other companies were developing that product, and Jobs said, we're not going to do that. We are going to, because I believe, and I believe based on how I think this technology advanced, it is truly in the best people interest for people to simply have an interface where they interact directly with the screen. They can type on the screen, they function through the screen. They're not using any other type of device that allows for more screen availability for the screen to basically cover the whole surface of the phone. It was determined that that was the right way to go. And then, of course, he decided that there would not be an earphone interface. You know, the idea that every phone had pretty much had an earphone jack, and he decides, no, we're not going to do that either. He relented a little bit in the fact that they developed the device that you could hook in through the power port, but he said, we're going to go with Bluetooth. We're gonna make it to where it's Bluetooth, because again, he said, we want to make this, as we don't want there to be any interface. We want to minimize the level of physical interface to facilitate a more virtual interface. And these were, of course, were not well thought of at the time. But subsequently, they totally changed the market for phones. You know, even eventually those of us who use Android products, basically we use the same device, we just use it with a different operating system. And, you know, his direction in terms of how the technology was developed and implemented and marketed basically forced people to shift to the way in which he adopted the product. A public policy example would be the implementation of digital signal for television, for over-the-air television. This was facilitated in the 90s and in the early 2000s. It was basically forced on everybody. And there were a tremendous number of people who did not have TVs that were compatible with digital signal. Now, many of them were getting it through their cable company, and the cable company could switch to digital or feed it through analog. But there were people that were like, why are we doing this transition? Companies, you know, broadcasters are like, why are we having to switch from analog to digital and all this? And the government forced it. And what the government realized was that it was going to dramatically change how we utilized broadcast technology. The advances that we've been able to make with streaming, with all of these improvements that we've been able to make to the entertainment and information value of video broadcasting would not have been possible without it. So what they did to facilitate it was they created a program where you would be eligible for up to 2 digital antenna converter boxes. So if you were getting over the air, if you were getting an over the air signal, you didn't have cable, you didn't have satellite, you were getting an analog TV, you had an analog TV antenna, you would get 2 converter boxes that you could put on your TV that would convert the digital signal coming in over the air and switch it into an analog signal for your television set. And this was done to accommodate the group of people that were like, I don't want to have to buy anything. Why should I have to buy anything? You're creating an undue burden on me. And that was done. And it was a fairly inexpensive proposition. But what it also did was that it enabled the adoption of flat screen television sets. These were purely digital. They did not want to have to reconvert analog signals to digital, and enabled us to move away from the old CRT cathode ray tube televisions that we had, both as television sets and computer monitors, to the flat panel displays, which has enabled us to do a lot of different things. It enables us to have the iPad, it enables us to have Microsoft Surface that I use, it enables us to have a much better technology. And this would be a merit one, because society itself didn't necessarily conceptualize what it was going to look like, or what it was going to be. Policymakers working with, in this case, it was a public-private partnership. They had to work with the industry, had to figure out how to achieve it. And so what merit wants do, as it says here, they help shape market and consumer preferences. This is where you, instead of the customer deciding what something looks like or what something is, either purely private or public private, they shape what it's supposed to look like. And there's a lot of this that has been attempted, and some of it's successful and some of it's not. You do it through various elements known as preference distortion. The probably the best example I can give of this, and it's a part, is that in the 2000s, a gentleman by the name of Cass Sunstein wrote a book called Nudge. And it was a behavioral examination in policy of how using merit wants, if we're trying to achieve merit wants, how behaviors can be distorted or manipulated to be able to enable merit wants to become social wants. So for one example, there's been a huge merit want in the public health community with respect to overcoming an issue that we have as a society, and that's obesity. And they're trying to figure out, and of course, the most common way that they want to address that is, how do we get people to eat healthier? We don't, as a society, forbid people from being able to cook and eat what they want. There's some minor limitations in what's available in the commercial sector, but people can very much grow and eat what they want. So they were trying to figure out ways that could be changed. And what Sunstein came up with was a way to deal with that. And we will get to that here in just a second. Okay, thank you for that. I had to take care of something. So talked about the, going back to the example that I was discussing with respect to obesity and preference distortion. The example was that borrowing from the nudge concept, the idea that they pushed was that one of the things that had been talked about for a long time was trying to give people more information about what they were eating from a caloric perspective at restaurants, particularly fast food restaurants. So they instituted a mandate during the Obama administration that applied to national fast food restaurants, and that they had to share the calorie information about food on their menus, going through drive-through and also inside the restaurant. And this was done in an effort to try to provide this information in the hopes that people would actually take that information into consideration in terms of what they ordered. And a whole host of other examples are out there as well. Another way that merit wants can be achieved is through overproduction and underproduction. A lot of times this is sometimes done in coordination with business, but sometimes directed at business. For example, the Energy Star program and the various efforts that have been made to improve energy and resource efficiency in appliances, household appliances. These standards have sometimes been enforced through mandate, but there have also been times when when it's been done in such a way to where manufacturers actually will overproduce an energy efficient model and underproduce an inefficient model. And they will get certain credits or certain benefits for doing that. They can also be tied to the CAFE standard issue, in that the idea was to overproduce fuel efficient vehicles and underproduce non-efficient vehicles. Didn't work out that way. Also giving information and knowledge of correct or better preferences. This idea of altruistic consumption that has been encouraged. There's a lot of different examples of that, particularly in today's marketplace. And also preference interference, the idea of basically trying to interfere with what preferences people may have in the marketplace to encourage them to move into a different path. So those are some examples that are out there that you see, and it's important to acknowledge and recognize them in the marketplace, just in general, just to know about them. So now let's talk about, with respect to chapter 9, chapter 8, economy and environmental rationale and ritual, we'll actually do this to start class on October 7th. We're going to look at the failure of the Delaware River Basin project, which is on pages 193 to 201 of the Wildofsky text, and talk about where they went wrong in the analysis. So what I would like to ask for everybody is to read over this prior to class on the 7th. Make sure you've read through this on page 193 to 201, and we'll just have a discussion to start class with on October 7th. So just do that, and that is how we'll approach it. That's really what we should cover with respect to chapter 8. We will talk about where the question that basically I'll ask for response from the audience is, where did the policymakers go wrong in their analysis in terms of this project? That's very important for us to understand. It's an environmental example and gives us an idea of some things to consider in future analysis, and particularly in today's time, as we continue to work with improving environmental conditions and avoiding a fallback to conditions that existed prior to the implementation of clean air and clean water legislation, and trying to create those balances that we have to within the context of society overall. So to wrap up for next week, for October 7th, continue work on cost benefit analysis, read chapters 9 and 10 in Wildofsky, in the Wildofsky text, in the GVMA and Wildofsky text that's available in the week 6 folder on Google Drive, chapter 2, and in chapter 3 of Snell, which is also in Google Drive. The course leading in lecture 2 assignment is available now. It covers weeks 3 through 5, and it's available at the link there. That deadline is going to be extended to October 11th. So you'll have until October 11th, so you'll have a chance also to go through week 6 in case you have any questions from this week's lecture. But it'll do by 6 p.m. on Tuesday, October 11th. And in the group assignment selection, I am getting that ready to send out, and that you'll have up until October 11th to select your topics. And again, it's a first come, first serve, and choose 3 topics from those that are provided to decide what you want to do. So look forward to seeing you all on October 7th, and have a good day, and thank you very much for joining. Take care.